Good afternoon. Welcome to another edition of Overcoming Adversity. I'm Dr. Adam Millman, also known as the Philosopherdoc. On Overcoming Adversity, we seek to find individuals who have stories that the viewers can learn from, where they not only undergo difficult experiences and struggle, and overcome the struggle and survive and then continue to thrive despite the struggle. These are individuals who experience things that none of us would ever wish to experience. And yet somehow they are able to overcome this experience and go on to have productive, fulfilling lives. As we all know, with adversity and struggle and challenge, difficult experiences, tragedy, many are not able to survive and overcome, and others are. So what we do is we attempt to learn from the stories, the thought process of those that are able to overcome these experiences so that we can apply their way of thinking to our own lives. So that when we are challenged with life's inevitable difficulties, we can use the thought pattern of those that are able to overcome and have overcome and apply that to our own life so that we can get past whatever struggle that we need to get through. You don't have to experience what the guests have experienced specifically, but when we use their thought patterns, when we use their way of thinking, their way of looking at the challenge, the meaning that they give to events, we are able to take their way of thinking and apply it to our own lives so that we can get through the challenge. But today we have a very special guest. Her name is Miss Lois Hockersmith, who I heard of years ago through one of my friends who you'll learn about in Lois's story. Lois experienced tragedy at a very early age, a very difficult childhood that did not go away when she entered into early adulthood. Hers is an experience that none of us would ever wish on ourselves or anyone that we know. But through Lois's experience and her triumph over the adversity, her way of thinking about events, we can apply this way of thinking to our own lives so that we can get through our own struggle. You'll hear a story that may be difficult for some to hear, but I think in the details you'll find the inspiration to get through whatever it is that you may be experiencing in your life and the lives of people around you. Miss Lois Hockersmith, please tell us your story, your wonderful story of you and your son, and how you are and how you came to be where you are today. Please tell us about you.
Sure. Well, it all started when I was born, and then just saying that in a joking manner. Obviously, my life started at that point, as most of ours do. So, as a child, I dealt with a rough childhood. I had didn't live in a household where love existed. My father was a cop, and it was kind of my first experience with an abusive person in my life. He grew up in a family, and I later learned, about his past. He was went to Vietnam. He was a POW, and there was probably reasons that made him how he was. Not necessarily excusing him, but I can definitely forgive and get past it, because holding on to how I was treated as a child. It was very strange to me because I have this, my brother and my sister, we all have the same parents, and we share both parents. And with that, I was definitely singled out. I was darker than my brother and my sister. I was singled out. Racism existed in my household. Abuse was mental abuse, emotional abuse, never shown love. I chalked it up to middle child syndrome, as did most people when I was a kid, but it was very, very different. And when I grew up, my brother and sister both definitely acknowledged how I was treated very differently than they were, and that it was hard for them as well. I never really thought about it being hard for them to watch. So growing up, and my father he wouldn't ground me. He would have me arrested. If I would go to my friends, he would call me a runaway, and then he would have, I had quite the record as a juvenile. When I was 8, I ended up being raped on the way to a friend's house, and people will take these scenarios and process them in different ways. I processed it. When I told my dad about it, he blamed me. And when that happened, as an 8-year-old child, and you think my dad's a cop, and this guy told me he would kill me and kill my family. And that, when my dad's a cop, I feel like, we'll see, my dad's a cop, and when my dad blamed me, I had to internalize it, and I turned it into, in my head, I processed as power. that I had this power over men, that they were willing to do these things regardless of the consequences. And I with it came a lot of not wanting to live in the reality of it. So drug use started when I was about 9, full-blown drug addict by the time I was 13. And I would use this, and sometimes I thought I was wearing a superhero cape, but I would find myself preying on predators that maybe had thoughts of doing things to kids or to girls. And I would put myself in a position, it started very young, I'd put myself in a position to lure them in and maybe act upon it, even though they weren't going to. But when I put them in the position where it was available, and then start crying, and then make them give me things to not tell on them. And that became a pattern of mine of manipulation. And it was really pretty sick. I mean, I knew right from wrong at an early age. And I now definitely, the number one thing that I do is take accountability for the position that, and not that it was okay, not that I'm excusing their behaviors or anything that they did to me, because as a child, what happened to me as a child happened to me. But there was a point when I knew right from wrong, and I continued to do it anyways, knowing that it was wrong. And then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, Lois, I don't want to go. Continue.
Okay. So, this continued into my teens. I ended up being emancipated when I was 16. I grew up in a small town. It was rough because my dad was a cop there. Everybody knew me, had a horrible reputation. No one was allowed to play with me when I was kids, just because, I was hanging out with the older kids and using and drinking and doing all of that. So I ended up moving to Tucson. And when I moved to Tucson, when I was emancipated, I was legally responsible for myself, but I lived with my aunt and my uncle. And then it just became a series of abusive relationships with men. I had my first kid. I got pregnant when I was 18, and I have 2 older children. I ended up having them when I was 19 and 20. At this point, I lost my mother. My mother ended up finally leaving my dad, who was very abusive to her as well. She finally left him, and 2 years later, she had a stroke, and through medical malpractice, she ended up dying, and she died on Mother's Day. So let me just throw this in my bag. Let me throw this in the bag of reasons I use. These are reasons I use, but they weren't. They were just, nobody ever asked why, because people watched what was going on with me, and nobody ever asked why I was destroying myself. So I just continued. It wasn't until I got sober where people started wondering, like, why, how did that happen? And that became a challenge in and of itself. So fast forward, my kids dad ends up going to prison, where he has spent majority of their life. I have my 2 kids, and I'm trying to function in full-blown addiction, living a lot of criminality, participating in a lot of criminality during this time, but also trying to not let people know it was going on. But I felt if they had their homework done and their clothes were clean and my house was clean, and having their homework done could mean me doing it for them so that I could go in the bathroom and use, so that I could go do what I needed to do. But it definitely kept up this facade that nobody realized what was going on in my household until I had a boyfriend that broke my arm, and my middle son called the police. When my middle son called the police, they came and took my kids for my capacity to protect them, my 2 older kids, for my capacity to keep them safe. And then I couldn't stay sober, because once they were gone and they took my kids away, couldn't stay sober for 3 days to get them back. Fast forward a little bit, lived in this time, my kids' dad's family, had private detectives, everything, trying to figure out what was going on, because it was kind of a shock to them, because I hid it. I hid what was going on, and then I just got tired, and I couldn't, because I couldn't stay sober. I stopped going to the meetings with CPS, and I let the state take my older kids, because I felt they were better off without me, better off if they just thought I was dead. They knew that I was an addict. They couldn't stay sober for them. And I ended up, that's when I ended up going to Vegas. I got to Vegas, and it was 2007. I was arrested 9 times at this time. Prostitution became how I was funding my drug habit, which was extreme, and so that caused extreme on both ends. Vegas just seemed like the best place to be, for this to happen. And I ended up, but I didn't know, coming from Tucson, didn't know what it was like in Vegas, didn't know about undercovers, didn't know about all of this, and was arrested 9 times the first year I was there. Was serving 9-month sentences here, 6-month sentences there, 3-month sentences there, always getting out, always knowing. I felt like I was a master at manipulation, and it worked pretty well. I mean, I could say the right things and knew what people needed to hear in order to let me out. And then in 2011, it was really bad. It was spiraling. A lot of the people I had been running with had ended up in prison. I really felt like I had nobody to protect me. I was having issues with the police, were being abusive. I've had police officers being abusive to me, and then me not having any, what am I going to do, call the police on the police? And so it got to a point where I just didn't care anymore, and I'm running around. And in April of 2012, I had gotten out in 2011. I had gotten out. Ended up doing 9 months in 2011. Got out in November, just full force. The minute I got out, felt like I had to make up for lost time. Just kept going. In April of 2012, I was with a friend who had got out of prison. We were smoking dope in a hotel room, and I got a bloody nose. And this is relevant. I got a bloody nose, and it wouldn't stop bleeding. And now, granted, also for about a month prior, I thought that I had had a stroke. My one side of my face was like droopy, like I couldn't even take a drink without spilling it. It was hard for me to hit my pipe, like just, in all graphicness of the situation. But it wasn't enough. I didn't care to stop, couldn't stay sober to go seek medical help. And so when I got this bloody nose, I ended up losing half the blood in my body, ended up in the hospital. It just it just started pouring out blood, and it turned out I had Bell's palsy. And I bled out the infection that cauterized my nose, sent me home. A month later is when I met your friend and my dear friend, Officer Rybeck. It was a month later, about a month and a half later. And, I didn't know, at this point it was getting picked up by undercovers. I had about 30 prostitution charges because I couldn't seem to stay out of jail. And it was my last arrest when I met Officer Rybeck. He did his job that night. I promise I wasn't the only one committing an illegal act on Boulder Highway, but I was the one he ended up picking up that night. And he ended up arresting me for on a prostitution charge. It was a sting. He was part of that unit. And he took me to jail, dropped me off, just doing what he did. Never once was he was not mean to me. He didn't treat me, and I got treated crazy by cops. But not Officer Rybeck was different. But I was tired and had been up for days. And when I got to jail, my blood pressure was super high, so they ended up taking me to the hospital over at Valley Hospital, and while in custody. And I woke up, I had fallen asleep because I'd been up for days, and when I woke up in the hospital, there was a doctor, a cop, and a priest there. And I knew why the doctor was there, and I knew why the cop was there, but what is he doing in here? I said about the priest, and they said, ma'am, your heart is failing, and if we don't do an emergency cesarean tonight, you're not going to make it. I said, what do you mean? What are you taking out of me? And they're like, well, you're 24, almost 25 weeks pregnant. And if you don't have this baby tonight, you're not going to make it. And I was like, what are you talking about? Had no idea I was pregnant. Still, there were signs that people get, the classic signs of menstruation, all that were still happening. I was using very, very heavily. I got really scared, didn't know what to say. I was like, well, I didn't have an attachment to a child I didn't even know existed. And I said, well, I still didn't believe them, but they said because I was in custody, I didn't have the option of trying to keep the baby in me because it was their responsibility to keep me alive because I was in state custody. So I had, they ended up doing a cesarean an hour after telling me this, and I gave birth to a 1-pound baby who they gave 1% chance of survival. He was addicted to everything. I didn't even know what to do. And then, I actually misspoke. That actually wasn't my last arrest because after having him, he lived. He's fine. He's a happy 10-year-old who's overcome all odds. And he is the light of my life. He's definitely, gives me a run for my money, super intelligent, has defied all odds that were given him. But, after I had him, I ended up leaving the hospital and going back out and using. I didn't know what to do. I didn't even know how to function. I didn't even know how to process what just happened to me. And I ended up getting arrested again about 3 weeks later. At this point, they weren't letting me go because I was being charged not just for the drugs I had when I got arrested, but for attempted involuntary manslaughter because of the condition of his birth. I can say I didn't know I was pregnant. I didn't know I was pregnant. I didn't know I was pregnant. But, I'm sure it gets said often in that situation by women who were in this, who were living the same lifestyle as me. So I end up going to court and get put in a program called the WIN Court, which is Women in Need of Change, with Judge Leung. And I said, well, I was tired, and I was like, I'm carrying around babies I don't know exist. I'm facing these charges, and even if it's for myself to not go to prison, let me go ahead and take this program. If it doesn't work, I can always go right back to where I started and go right back to that hotel room if it doesn't work. And I got through it. I got through it a day at a time. Like, the biggest thing was, like, I didn't have to. They kept telling me in AA, join AA. They kept telling me you don't have to do it forever. Just do it today. And that kind of took the overwhelmingness of, like, how am I going to not drink? How am I going to not use at weddings and celebrations and birthdays and when I'm sad and when I'm happy and when, and getting through it a day at a time. Meanwhile, my son was in the NICU. He was in the NICU for 6 months. And I ended up getting through the program. It was a prostitution diversion program, so they didn't allow us to work for a year. They wanted us to learn to live in means. So it was a great program. They provided trauma counseling. They provided a lot of things that I never had. Nobody ever told me I didn't have to do this. Nobody ever told me it was okay to not do this. And that program really, really, really was the beginning of changing my life. But again, as Officer Ryback, had he not arrested me that night, like I said, I wasn't his only choice of somebody that was out there. And he did pick up me. And that night, he saved the life of me and my child. My heart was failing. Had he not picked me up, I wouldn't have gone to jail and I wouldn't have gone to the hospital. I would have gone to the dope dealer. And so definitely my hero. Definitely a hero.
That was amazing. I want to honor you for having the courage and the transparency to share that with people. That is a story that you hear about in movies or in literature, but the fact that you were able to overcome that and be where you are today with that baby is amazing. I love what you said at the end of the article that I read about you. It said that not all heroes come in capes. Sometimes they wear badges.
Yeah.
And if Officer Ryback hadn't done what you didn't really like that night, which is taking you away from what you wanted to be doing, you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't, and the baby was now 10 years old.
Yeah.
Wouldn't be here either. So I guess a couple things that the situation can look quite dire, and then very quickly can turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to you. And sometimes you have to reach that point where you have to go through this experience, but from that experience you grow and eventually find something that you didn't even know was possible for you, which is the salvation of your own life, but then the salvation of a life that you didn't even know existed, all of it being brought up to Valley Hospital. I wanted to go back to Lois and ask you a couple things, because you weren't a bad person the day that you were born, and you're not a bad person now, and you weren't a bad person then. But your activities were probably not consistent with what you would consider to be a virtuous person. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think caused things to go off in the direction that you would not want to say for your child today? Was it the way your father made you feel about yourself?
Yes. The
way he treated you and the way you see yourself? Because the way you see yourself is how you're going to function. Sure. If you have a poor self-image, then you're going to operate to be consistent with that self-image. So if you see yourself, I tell my patients as a fat person, then months or years later, when you go through some emotional struggle, you view yourself as a fat person. So it's easy to go back to eating the wrong food because that's how you view yourself. And your body goes to work to complete the image that your mind creates of yourself. So if your father made you feel a certain way about yourself, then maybe it's easier to take upon this lifestyle because you're just being consistent with what he said was going to happen to you and how you saw yourself. So crimes and drugs and then you said later prostitution would be consistent with how he made you feel about yourself. So maybe it doesn't even seem like it's such a wrong thing to do because you're just doing what your dad said was going to happen to you anyway. So just tell me what happened. At what point did you decide to go? You have the opportunity to go in several different directions, but you went off in a direction when you were very young. It's like before you're 8 years old, that was probably not what your grandparents or great-grandparents would have wanted for you.
Sure. So it was, I believe that there's types of personalities, and I have taken many personality tests over in many different points of my life, and the type A, the red personality, people function from different standpoints of what makes them, what motivates them, whether it's love, peace, happiness, or power. And I had no power as a child. And so when I took power of that situation by turning a tragedy into power, and it allowed me to start feeling powerful, it really truthfully had nothing to do with my dad, and I mean, at the time I used it because it sounded better to say that it was him than it was me. Like, I mean, how am I going to, if I say it's me, I got to do something about it. But if I say it's him, what can I do about it? How am I going to change that? And so, I mean, and this is obviously hindsight looking at it now, but at that time I just took the route of, instead of being the victim of that crime that happened to me, is turned it into a power of sorts in my head that was really destroying my life. By all means, it was like giving up every power I had to drugs and to everything else. But at the time, it just seemed like how I was able to function and continue was to call it something different than it was. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Okay, sorry about that. You're going to see my little 10-year-old run by. He's got to get something.
It's okay. It's a blessing.
My mistake, sorry.
So, Lois, when you're very young, the difference between the stimulus and your response are the same because you're kind of molded by your parents, or whatever. You don't really, but then as you get older, there starts to become a separation. Under the Stephen Covey of the famous 7 Habits book describes it as being the space between the stimulus and the response lies your freedom and your ability to choose your reaction. And you can choose to react this way or this way. With self-awareness and self-reflection and a consciousness, you have the ability to decide how to act in any situation. But when you're a child, you don't really have that. But as you get older, well, there's a small space here. I can react to this, and I can look at a situation as being as X, Y, or Z, and I can give it this meaning, and I can learn from it in this way, or I could use it for this, or use it for this. So as you got older, when these bad things were happening to you, how did you view why these things were happening to you? And then you said you wanted to go off and use this situation, respond, and gain power from it over other people because you lost your power. So now you were going to use what power you had against, with interacting with other people, not maybe against them, but with other people in a way that a child doesn't normally do.
So, and which is, I was always smart. When I was a kid, it was straight A's academically. Got the Presidential Achievement Award signed by Ronald Reagan when I was a kid. Never, I've never was not aware of what I was doing. I was not, but I was, I placed a meaning of power as a child. When I started to get older, that didn't work for me so well, because if I kept that made me an incredibly horrible person as an adult, and it wasn't conducive with me continuing it and feeling like a horrible person. So as I got older, all of a sudden it felt better victim mentality. To be the victim of these abusive men, to be the victim of an abusive childhood, to be the victim. And then nobody wondered why, because I was just drinking and using away my pain, and I was drinking and using away my situation. And this is how I was coping with these men who were beating me and, in very, very, very abusive situations with some of them that I was in. The fact that I'm alive is sometimes just like I have to, am I really, or was this, sometimes my life is so normal now that it's very weird to look back and to think that was actually my life and not really that long ago. not really that long ago that, I mean, it's in relativity to, the healing that has occurred in the last 10 years.
And Lois, how did the healing happen? There's this example given of a scar on the face. This plastic surgeon Maxwell Maltz in this book, Psycho-Cybernetics, writes about having physical scars and emotional scars. And you can be damaged in a relationship, often with a woman with a man. And now you create this hard external emotional shell, so now you can't have a normal relationship with any men. And that protects you from being hurt. It also protects you from experiencing intimacy and physical pleasure and emotional connection with people, but it protects you from pain. But it also protects you from something that could be fulfilling. The physical scar protects, you get injured, the physical scar will protect that area from future damage. And then it can be removed. The surgeon can fix the scar. And the same thing can happen emotionally. You can fix the emotional scar, but it's how did you go about doing it? So the focus wasn't always protecting yourself from damage and from pain and from attack, but so you could go on and have relationships with people and not always be on the defensive about worrying that you're going to be hurt because you were hurt in the past. So now how can I prevent that from happening? So you could release yourself from this protective scar that you've had since you were a kid. How can you go on to have better relationships because of it? How did that happen?
So, going through the Wind Court, and then after Wind Court, and there's a lot to the story with Officer Rybeck. I had several jobs. I worked for Google. I was did very well with interviews, got into great jobs. I ended up getting hired at Hope for Prisoners. Hope for Prisoners was a program I also went through, which was a prison reentry. There was a lot in that helped change my criminal mentality, but accountability where it doesn't matter, stop arguing with people about things that were true about me. It's especially there was a lot of family members who would try to be like, that was horrible when you did that. And then I would start making excuses. And I learned to say, you're right. It was horrible. It was horrible for me too, and taking accountability.
Why? When did that happen? Because, Lois, you said you were arrested 8 or 9 times in a short period of time. You were using all these drugs. You didn't even know that you were pregnant. So you were in this like dream world outside of reality to the point where you were pregnant for 6, 7 months. And
not even that long.
You could have easily gone. You got out of the hospital. You got out of jail, and you easily could have ended up in the same situation. Or dead. But you didn't. At what point did you decide that you needed to make some change? Was it for the sake of your baby? Was it for the sake of how you now started to view yourself? Is that I'm not this person that needs to abuse themselves and allow other people to hurt me? And what changed inside of you? Because none of these changes would have happened, I don't think, unless you started viewing yourself differently than with the way you viewed yourself as a child. Something now worthy of success, worthy of love, worthy of accomplishment, as opposed to worthy of only being abused by other people. What changed in you to get you on the totally different trajectory that you now are? You are the recipient of that change in direction. What changed in you?
I forgave myself. I forgave myself and letting go of if you can imagine giving birth to a baby you didn't know existed as 1% child, to feel like I just killed a person, not even intentionally, but I also didn't intentionally save it, especially when it's your own child. And, back to that story, and I was going to wrap back around, I forgot, but the bloody nose, right? So going back to the bloody nose, this was a month before I had Jamel, a month before I gave birth to him. I, had that bloody nose and went to the hospital that night and had a blood pregnancy test. And that blood pregnancy test was negative a month before I had him. It was a month before I gave birth. And that's how they dropped. That's how I was able to get away. I don't want to say get away, but that was the proof that I didn't know I was pregnant. So when I was being charged with this attempt, I still had to, the Wind Court was, they sealed my record. They cleaned my record from all that if I completed it, it was hard. It was a lot of accountability. They had to know where I was 24 hours a day, and I was not ready to have that. I've never had that accountability in my life where I did it. And, my son's in foster care. He can't come to the sober living houses because he's medically fragile. My son was in foster care with a woman named Bonnie Ballard. Miss Bonnie, where she became Miss Bonnie, she became grandmother. She became a person that passed away 2 years ago and left me everything she owned. I was the only mother that ever came back for a kid. I'm like everything. So when you like that, everything that happens for a reason, and that bloody nose happened for a reason. I'd be in prison if it didn't happen. And the burning bush moments when you just realize that I don't have as much control of the situation as I like to believe God has this planned out for me. And I'm living it, and everything that I'm going through, if I just listen and I take the time to go through it and trust the process. And trusting the process is not easy for someone who rebelled against every process ever invented my whole life, just trying to rebel against the process of a family and the process of school and the process of doing the right things, and learning to trust a process has been beneficial. You do the right things happen. And that started showing me really quickly that when I started, whether I wanted to or not, if I was mad, I did it mad. If I was sad, I did it sad. But doing the right things was producing the right results.
Yeah, excellent. And that was not the case before.
No.
Before you said, here's this stimulus outside of me, and because I view myself as a victim, and maybe deserving of this, then I'm just going to take that to just reinforce what I already think about how I view myself and my situation. I'm going to use that to justify it. But then you said that the bloody nose you now ascribe a different meaning to. Yeah. So searching and finding meaning in different things. I mean, people ask this question, what is the meaning of life? And maybe on a more practical level is, what is the meaning of this individual thing? What does it mean to me? What meanings can I give it in order to better understand and motivate me to kind of plow through this obstacle that I need? How can I use this to get past whatever obstacle is there? So this bloody nose, if it wasn't for that, then this wouldn't have happened. And it's lots of ways to look at every event. And you can really look at the event through your glasses. If you gave me your glasses, I wouldn't be able to see. And if I gave you, mine are probably much, much stronger. It's very, very poor. If I gave you wouldn't be able to see. And I'd say, but no, just try harder. You can see through my glasses, and you would say, but no, you should be able to see through mine. But it doesn't work because we all see the world differently, and understanding that the way you see it is not the way I see it. So, but people can look at the same situation and find very different meanings. So when you start to find the meanings that can benefit you in what your goal is, then you really can find that. Then you really have the resources and the tools to get through any situation. I liked how you said that you now developed accountability. Yeah, so if you don't think that you're constantly being acted upon by external circumstances and that you're just really being blown around like without a captain in the sea, then anything that happens to you, you don't take responsibility for. But when you take responsibility for your own life and your own actions and the consequences, you can choose your own response to everything. And if it doesn't work out, okay, it didn't work out. But when you think that, well, I did this, so now I have to have that. Now I have to look at the consequence, and whatever happens. But what's happening to me is mostly driven by my actions, as opposed to other people and other forces acting upon you. But the Lois said something. Go ahead. I apologize.
On that note, I just wanted to go back around to Officer Ryback. So most people don't know the officer that arrested them. I didn't know who Officer Ryback was, other than I knew I was arrested that night. I know it wasn't one of the most disgraceful, because I've had some very the arrests were so just damaging to who I was, because it's just a way of life in Vegas. I don't want to necessarily get into that or talk about the police in that way right now, because I feel like the community has healing that many communities don't in Las Vegas. Mm-hmm. And so I started working for the program Hope for Prisoners. I went through the program, then I became a mentor to other people going through the program, and then John Ponder offered me the job at Hope for Prisoners. I was the first subject matter expert. Everybody else hired as case managers for prison reentry, had degrees. He hired me as a subject matter expert. I went through it. I got through it, share what I did with people like me to help them make different decisions. So at one point he said, well, I wonder let's find out who the cop that arrested you was. And so that's when we went and we found out that it was Officer Ryback. And Officer Ryback had been training at Hope for Prisoners for years. He's one of the trainers. So the first time that I ran, the next time I saw Officer Ryback, I went up to him and when I found out who he was, and I'm like, "Are you Officer Ryback?" And he's like, he had came with a bunch of the other cops and a bunch of other people from police agencies that were going to do a presentation to the class. And he says, "Oh yeah, go sign in over there." And I'm like, "No, sir, I'm not the police. My name is Lois Hockersmith." And we got to sit down and talk about our story. And he keeps a picture of my son's footprint. And
wow.
when he was born, and a picture of my arrest record on his desk. But we got to start teaching that class together. And if you can imagine, when you're speaking to a room full of people who just got out of prison, who hate the police, and then you got the police here who, have put many of them in, and they're trying to find some cohesive to how can we, not arrest our way out of problems. And then, we were able to teach this class where I did some of the training in Hope for Prisoners as well. There's like a week-long workshop, and then on Fridays, the cops come in, and Officer Ryback and I got to start teaching that together.
Wow.
Teaching them together, because he starts doing this presentation, and then he says, "I want to talk about miracles," and we get to have, he does this thing where he hands out coins, and he talks about the shekel, how that's that God would give out the shekel to everybody, and then he hands them out, and he says, don't go spending them, and he collects them again, and he's like, now can you pick out yours? And but he goes around and gives everybody, including all the cops, one. And then, when he would come to me and I would say, "Oh, I'm not taking money from you ever again," just because. But, it was a time to make everybody see the purpose of what the police are doing, and the police to see that, give them a purpose too. Like, if I help these people instead of, disgrace them or do whatever when I arrest them. So it became a healing moment where, his class would come in and watch us teach together. His classes from UNLV would watch us teach together. The prisoners coming out of prison would watch us teach together. I don't know. We met the president of the United States, regardless of political views. Donald Trump asked to meet me and my son. And, because of that, it was funny because of that, there was limited amount of cops that could be in there because Secret Service didn't want the guns. And I remember Officer Ryback saying, "I just want to thank you. Because of your recovery, I get to meet the president of the United States." And I said, "Well, that's because of what you did that allowed for this." And he's like, "Well, I just don't even know how to thank you. I said, just don't make it a privilege to arrest me."
Oh.
But
Lois, that's the first time I saw you. Many of viewers probably don't know that I've known Steve Ryback, I think, since 2005, 2006. Our kids go to school together. I see him literally every single week for a decade and a half. And I spoke with him last night about our upcoming interview, and he's the one that put you in touch with my wife, who wants to also volunteer, and I offered to volunteer as well for the same program to try to help these people get their lives back on track. Because, Lois, you know better than most, is that some of these kids could literally come up to, you could say to the person who's a doctor, "Well, my parents always told me that, I should be a doctor, and now I'm a doctor." But there are kids whose parents literally tell them, "You're going to end up in jail. You're going to end up in jail. You're going to end up behind bars. I know what's going to happen." So you could say to them, that the person could say, "Well, I really just did what my dad told me was going to happen, or my mom was going to happen." Because from the time they're a child, they think their self-image is somebody that doesn't deserve anything. But Steve Ryback sent me a link. It said, "Watch this at this specific point," and I'm watching it. It's President Trump talking, and then all of a sudden there's Lois, and then there's Steve Ryback. And I told all of our friends, and the next day when he came into synagogue, everyone stood up and clapped for him. And they were clapping because of you, Lois. They weren't clapping because he's with the president. They were clapping because of you and your son. It's an amazing story. You don't hear stories about how the police do stuff like this. A lot of the attention is negative in the news, and some of it's deserved, I suppose. But there's much positive that's going on that I think people are unaware of. Rehabilitation of prisoners. What's going to happen to somebody like Lois? Is she just going to end up going back and forth in jail? What's going to happen to her kids? If you don't fix the underlying problem, then you're going to keep ending. If you're doing the same thing, you're always going to have the same results. But if you fix what you're doing, then you can have different results. So getting at why you're acting this way, why you think this about yourself, why you think you need to go to drugs and prostitution, and maybe the later day we'll talk about what has to happen in the mind of someone where they now are okay with prostitution. Like, what has to happen in your mind to to use drugs, to commit crimes, and then to engage in prostitution. What do you have to think about yourself in order for you to do something like that? And if we don't fix this, we're going to have all the same problems. You're not somebody that should have been using drugs. Should you be in jail for the next 50 years of your life? Or should we fix that problem by fixing how you see yourself? And then you become a productive member of society. Now your kid's not in foster care. It's kid's with his mom. Kid's not going to end up better necessarily being with foster parent than with his own mother, especially when his mother gets on the right track.
Right. And even my son would go, and he would go to Hope for Prisoners, and if they didn't want to listen to me, they didn't want to listen to John, the founder, they didn't want to listen to the cop. When you have a 5-year-old that was born into addiction on the night his mom was arrested, talking to them about perseverance, because he is the prime example of perseverance, and he's talking to these people who are just fresh out of prison, and he keeps telling them perseverance was a word that he was taught very young. He says it just means to try and try again. And he would get up there and say that. And, the impact that we could make for the positive to not, and not they said, because they said he would never walk. They said he would never talk. They said he would never read. And he walks, talks, reads. He's a star student in his class almost every year since, in a college prep class. He's a super bright kid. And this is all grace. This is all grace. This isn't all what we deserve, but we get it anyways.
And Lois, tell us, what was his chance of survival and how much did he weigh when he was born?
He was 1 pound, he was 9 inches, and he had a 1% chance of survival because on top of being 1 pound and 9 inches, I had been using the entire time, including the night that I had him. So he was born highly addicted to drugs. It was just a garbage can of the different drugs that I was doing at that point. And, he had a stroke the first week. There was many things that unless I were to tell you, he was diagnosed with cerebral palsy. That's why I said he would never walk around. You saw him walk by, rides bikes, climbs, doesn't sit down for 5 seconds sometimes. But, just to know his survival rate, and then his foster mom, and he was the 13th foster child of her, and he gave her, she was a Christian woman who, she didn't have any children, only medically fragile children. And what's crazy is the CPS, when she was in CPS, he was still on oxygen, and I would have visits, and she was supposed to take him to Child Haven, and she's like, I'm not taking this kid to Child Haven on oxygen. It's too much for him. It's too much for me. And they're like, well, you don't want her in the house, because the lady from CPS literally called me the worst of the worst. You don't want her in her house. Miss Bonnie said she can sit on her damn hands if she feels like she's going to steal from me. She can come in her house and sit on her hands if she wants to see her child. And, Miss Bonnie became grandmother. She became like I said, she passed away 2 years ago. But after the President Trump thing with me and Officer Ryback, that CPS worker that said that, she said, I called you the worst of the worst. And I just want you to know that I will do anything for any of your clients that you feel stand the same chance that you do in order to help them get their kids back. And she's like, I apologize. The CPS worker from, 8 years prior called and apologized to me. You don't owe me an apology. You were right. You were right at that time. But, God just had different plans.
That's right. And that I think that's what I wanted to ask you about as well, Lois. You said God had different plans. When you were in your worst state, and maybe it was the night, maybe it was when you were sexually assaulted when you were 8. Maybe it was when the night that you found out that you were pregnant and you almost died. Did you view yourself as having a connection with a higher power, the Almighty, with spirituality? And if you didn't, at what point did that become relevant? And the way it now seems to be, of how you view yourself when you say God had another plan for me. So if God has another plan for you, then how did that happen, where you thought that there was some divine providence, that there was something else running the show, that there was a knock on the door and all you had to do was to open up the door to invite something that into your life that could help you? When did that happen?
So, I can say as a kid, I was raised Catholic. I was, baptized, made my first communion. But, all that meant was actually getting a little bit of wine on Sunday. And it's crazy that how young I acknowledged that I was going to get to go to church and have a little sip of wine, don't eat breakfast. The addiction played a part so early in my life that I remember these things. Where it was
the alcohol. I'm sorry, Liz. Do you think the alcohol at that age may have facilitated, I think, the higher likelihood of you developing a substance abuse by being exposed to alcohol that young, or maybe your father also, maybe he drank or your mother drank?
No, neither of them did. Neither of them did, which was, my dad was my mom never smoked, never drank, never took care of herself. When she died, it was medical malpractice, and that's when she died on Mother's Day. Like I said, that just fueled it. I really didn't believe in God in the least bit. My entire life. I just went about, because again, anything that wasn't conducive to what I was doing, I knew how to block it out. And religion definitely was one of those things. And then, it was not after I had my son. It was right after I had him, I remember being in a hotel room and I was high and I had to go back out because I was out of dope, and I had to go back out, and I was like, I have this baby in the hospital. I know CPS is looking for me. And I just remember saying, God, help me, before I walked out. Because and it was just almost a figure of speech. And I went to jail again that night. And that was the last time I ever used. It was May 25th, 2012.
Okay.
And it was, and after that, going through the 12-step program, and I could say that was a huge help to me, and to learn how to separate accountability and guilt and what was my part in things, compared, not placing this on other people, learning to accept my part. And if I took my part of those things, those cycles stopped happening. Those people didn't get the chance to do the things that they did if I took the part that I did out. And part of that is acknowledging that there's a power greater than myself. That could do this, because if I was the power, I would have stopped a long time ago. If I had the power to do it. And when I stayed sober, the first 9 months, when I got my first 9-month chip, and I was like, it's not me. It's not me, because if I could have done it, if my kids could have done it, if my parents could have done it, if my friends could have done it, if a human could have done it, they would have did it, because there's many humans that wanted to do it, including myself, but I couldn't. And it wasn't until I accepted that there was a higher power than me that could help me through this.
Right. It's that exchange of power. I remember there's a verse in Isaiah about that, about exchanging your power for God's power. Yeah. And then when you have that, it really isn't anything that you can't accomplish.
Let it go to the steering wheel. Let go of that steering wheel and let him take over. And since the day that I did that, and I just gave it over to him, like you're going to do, it's happening anyways, because there's many times I should have died. There's, being tied up and taken to Lake Mead with a guy with a chainsaw. And I made it through everything. I made it through everything that I ever made it through. That many people don't. There was no doubt that he had a purpose for me. And the purpose was definitely to raise this boy, to raise my son. Okay. And for him to be born. So there's no doubt that there's greatness in that, so I gotta keep up what I need to keep up to get him to where he needs to be.
So you keep finding more reasons to stay alive, right? If I survive this, that means I can survive this. And now I have this child, and now I have faith in a higher power, and that higher power is directing me and control, and I just have to release a certain amount of my wantingness to control the situation for some higher power's purpose. Everyone always has a reason when they survive things. They survive things because of a few different reasons. But it's rarely just, I need to survive because of me, because it's important to me. But it seems like it's something external. People that care about you, people that you care about, a child, a family member, faith in the Almighty. Viktor Frankl, when he was in the concentration camp, said, I need to get out of here so I can teach other people about what's going on. I need to teach them about this. And it was this idea that this would end, and I will now move on to this. But the meaning that I have from these experiences, I will be able to bring to my students in Vienna. When the war is over, when it's over, I'll get back to doing what I was doing, and I will teach people about this. And people in prison camps, you used to mention your father. They, the famous one, General Robbie Reisner, who was eventually stationed at Nellis, said his faith in the Almighty. We had prayer groups, and he was able to survive because of that. And other people are not able to survive. Yeah. Everyone finds a different way, but it's got to be something outside of you. So, Lois, what And maybe to conclude, what would you say for people that haven't gone through an experience like yourself for so many years? What would be your advice to people that are struggling with something and they're not really sure how to think about it and how to process it, looking for motivation? What would you tell someone in the situation that you're in, or just in a general struggle? How can they think about things differently in order to get through it? What advice would you give to everybody?
And it's a big thing, because I feel like what I've been through is extreme, but there's people who have been through worse than me. There's people that have been through 10 times worse than me, 5 times worse than me. There's people who let their bottom be 10 times not as far as where I've been. You have to let your bottom be your bottom, and when you're done, be done. When you're done, be done. When you're going through it, you don't have to. The day at a time thing is huge for me. Is get through today, get through today, and whatever it is that's plaguing you, just get through today. You don't have to worry about getting through tomorrow, because you're worried, and I'm a worrier. I have to work on that. Is you can't ruin today by worrying about tomorrow. You haven't even gotten through today. Get through today. Okay. Get through today. Make today the best day that today can be. And then, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I remember the expression, by a mile it's a trial, but by an inch it's a finch. So
yeah.
Each day, the brother's cleaning your garage or writing thank you notes for your son's 10th birthday. Each day. When you're traveling, I know you're in Arizona, so you're traveling on desolate highways, and you can't always see that far. You can see maybe 100 yards, especially when it's foggy, but you go that 100 yards, and now you can see another 100 yards. But it's just that you're just going just a little bit at a time, working towards something. And
a burden shared is a burden halved, and that's a big thing, is reach out. You don't have to do it alone. There's people who have been there. There's people, no matter what it is that you're going through, somebody's been through it, and there's help. And you don't have to be ashamed to need help. You don't have to be ashamed to accept help. You don't have to be ashamed to be getting help. Because I remember when I first started going to AA, I was there and I was like, oh, there's microphones under these tables. They're waiting for me to admit the things I haven't been caught for. And, just thinking, and at some point I had to realize, and not to contradict being that important, but I'm not that important. They're not setting up people to come into AA and spy on me, to wait for me to tell on something. These are other people here getting help. There's support groups. There's pretty much a support group for anything that you are going through. There's therapists, there's doctors, you've got to reach out, because if you reach out and you share it with somebody, then you put it on, because if it's somebody worth sharing with, be careful who you share it with, obviously. But the burden shared is a burden halved is a big thing for me, because I felt like I had to do everything alone. I had to do everything alone because I felt so alone my whole life. And once I reached out and let other people help me, the things that other people did to help me was just incredible. What people's willingness to help other people really does exist.
So they must have viewed you in a way that you had not yet viewed yourself. Yeah. For somebody to take Lois may have done these things, but Lois is maybe a child of God. And I'm going to find that spark in Lois, and I'm going to turn it into a fire. Even if Lois can't see it in herself, I'm going to make Lois see it. And I'm going to cultivate Lois's strengths, and I'm going to allow them to, like a fire with embers. You don't always have to add anything to it to get it to burn. You just have to blow on it a little bit, and then the embers turn into a raging fire. Because within Lois and within everybody is this unbelievable potential that has to be unlocked. And it sounds like that your support, maybe AO, Steve Rybeck, had this seed that they were able to insert in Lois and turn it in such a way that you now viewed yourself the way they viewed you. And what would you say to people that view themselves in a way where they're not even going to seek to get help because they're a loser? They're a loser. They're pathetic. They're stupid. Their ex-husband was right about them. Their father that was abusive was right about them. They'll never amount to anything. How do you change that, Lois, in someone so that they can then liberate themselves from the situation that they're in? Because if you see yourself in a bad way, I don't know if any of the help is really going to work until you change how you see yourself.
It's really hard. There's many things in life you have to separate. So you have to separate grief from guilt, and you have to separate like the different parts of mental health from each other, and recognize each one what they're from. Because guilt is something, self-forgiveness. Forgive yourself. If you want anybody to forgive you, you've got to forgive yourself. If you don't forgive yourself, how can you expect this person who's already upset with you to forgive you if you can't even forgive yourself? And once you forgive yourself, the external, there's people that don't forgive. I do have family members that don't forgive me, but I don't let them sit here and abuse me either. Like, you have the right to not forgive me. Give people the right to their emotions, and let them.
When you forgive them, Lois, then they can't trap you anymore. The people that you hold these feelings towards, dead or alive, when you have these feelings towards them, they've trapped you. You're not able to get past it because they control your emotions. It's a strange thing to wrap your head around. And I remember I used to hear people a long time ago talking about abuse, and they would say, I forgive you for killing my child. I forgive you for raping me. That did not make sense to me. How does that help you? But how does holding in pain forever of what they would you help? I'm not sure what the right answer is, because I haven't been in a position to forgive somebody that's hurt me in such a horrible way.
It's just recognizing you can't let them win again, because they're probably not sitting somewhere thinking about the hurt they caused you. And if I'm sitting here hurting about it again while you're sitting there living your life free, I'm letting you win again. Stop letting the bad people win. So stop letting people. I realize that other people's opinions of me is none of my business. It's not my business. That's their business.
Right. And for people that are reactive, Lois, that have a poor self-image, whatever someone thinks about them is how they think about themselves. It doesn't matter if it's somebody passing on the street that doesn't make eye contact. Of course they do make eye contact. Look at me. Who am I? Why would somebody want to look at me in the eye? Wow, it's amazing how we can destroy ourselves based on what we allow to control us and influence. Like a thermometer that responds to the temperature as opposed to a thermostat that controls the temperature. If you're always reactive, if we don't have that good self-image, then we'll always be played upon. If you have a good self-image, what's going on around you and the people that are upset or happy, they don't influence you as much, especially if they're not close to you. But when that self-image is poor, whatever anybody is telling you is going to, you're the worst of the worst, Lois. You're the worst of the worst. So at that point, you know what? Of course I'm the worst of the worst. But now I bet you don't think that you are. And that was a description of your behavior. That's not you. That's a description of what you were doing. And the people that look at you as the worst, maybe they treat you as the worst. And if you look at this kid is always not going to be able to succeed because look how young he is when he was born and all the problems he had, he's never going to do well. I'm going to treat him that way. We're never going to test him because look at him, how he was born. He'll never do better. And that probably would influence how you would raise him. And maybe he would be much worse off now because of how you viewed him. And it may not have been the correct way.
So when he was younger, he used to have to see 5 different therapists per month for the first 3 years. It was occupational, physical, nutritional, psychological. There were 5 different therapists every month he would have to see. And before I forgave myself, I would get mad at them. I would get mad at them because you kept telling me he needs more and more help. And every time you told me that, it affected my guilt. And I'm letting you so there's when it's John Ponder is the one that taught me about the enemy that's in me. If I let these enemies of guilt and shame live in me, anybody who affects those things is going to become an outer enemy to me. Right. I think it was like the enemy on the inner me, so inside of me when I had the guilt and the shame and it's not definitely not the ideal way I want to give birth to somebody by any means. But if I forgive myself for that situation and I let the doctors do what the doctors do and the psychologists do what the psychologists do and the occupational therapist do what he does without letting them make me feel guilty because they're helping my son, all of a sudden it really became help. And I was able to participate in the help with them because when I forgave myself, you stopped making me feel guilty. You didn't make me feel guilty. I allowed myself to feel guilty because I was feeling guilty and shameful for how I was born, and now he has to go through this. And I wouldn't participate. I would be very standoffish when they would come, and they would it would affect me greatly because he needed help instead of participating in the help because I can be better moving forward.
Right. Nobody can. And Eleanor Rosa doesn't know. Nobody can make you inferior without your permission.
Yeah,
you can feel a way, but they're not. They're saying this. You can feel however you want to feel, and if your image is bad, if you think, what they're saying is true, because look at me, then what they're saying is going to have a bad effect, and you hold yourself accountable because of how the boy's doing now. Maybe in your mind because of things that you did so long ago that they're not even relevant anymore.
Yeah,
I think Lois, your view of the future is now so much different than your view of the past. And how you view your future is infinitely more important than anything that's happened in your past. If you focus on that, The guilt feelings that you have for the past don't help you. Learning from it, but the guilt doesn't inspire you and provide you with motivation to get better. I don't think it's a helpful emotion, and I think once you get rid of that guilt because you've forgiven yourself, not that what you did was right in the past, but you can't change what you did in the past. So to hold on to it with the guilt feelings as if you're going on today, and you're trying to do the right thing, I think that can trap people, and it can prevent them from moving forward. I made mistakes in the past, so I don't deserve to be happy in the future because all the stuff I can never be forgiven for. I think you're looking at it entirely the right way, Lois, is that these things happen, and I made mistakes, but I'm not making them now, and I'm going to do what I can to get better. And I remember what I did, but it's not going to trap me. Yeah. And I'm not going to let people make me feel bad because of what happened before, because that's not me anymore. And Lois, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. It was really like a life-changing experience to hear all the struggles starting from when you were very young, moving through, and then forces seem to be moving things in a certain direction so that that comes into your life, the hospital, and then here you are today with a beautiful, beautiful boy who's 10 years old, and the sky's the limit for the two of you. And the success, and the more you help other people, the more successful you'll probably be, because you're not focused on yourself. It's not like my life is now in order. My son and I, this is it. You're helping other people constantly, so the benefits will continue to multiply in your life as you continue to help other people. Because
I have my 24-year-old son and his girlfriend and my twin granddaughters that live in my 4-bedroom house. 10 years ago, a little over 10 years ago, I was living in a hotel room. Now I have a 4-bedroom house where my 6-month-old granddaughters, my other son that I lost custody of, his girlfriend, they live with me. Mel has a family. That's all he ever wanted because it was just me and him. His father was murdered when he was 3 because he didn't get out of a lifestyle. And here we are, and we have this whole family. The dog, short of the white picket fence, but it's just because there's not white picket fences in Arizona. But it's just amazing how much can happen, how different life can be, by just allowing it to be different.
Yeah. And to close with this, I remember Ziegler said that you can have everything in life you want if you will just help enough other people get what they want. And Lois, you more than most people I think I'll ever meet are focused on helping other people get their lives in order. Not for money and not for fame, but it seems like you've reaped the blessings by being helped and now continuing to help other people, not being focused on yourself, continuing to help other people. Lois, you should go on to have many, many, many years of success, and everybody should be blessed with the opportunity to meet you and your colleagues, the people you've trained, and your son, to see what is possible, to see the depths that somebody can come from and the heights that can be achieved by getting their life in order, getting help, and then continuing to help other people, Lois. I really appreciate it, Lois. Please stay in touch, okay? Good luck to you and the kids and in the project. Okay, would you like to mention it again so we could, please mention it again so we could, the projects that you're involved in, the programs that you're involved in.
So Hope for Prisoners, I still mentor from afar, but that's in Vegas. But Hope for Prisoners, again, the WIN Court in Las Vegas, helping women overcome adversity and trauma. It's a trauma-based court for women. There was We Care, and it was a sober living home that brought me into the program of AA and NA and getting involved with that. But Vegas has, people think of Vegas as Sin City, but for it to not spontaneously combust, they have just as big of a recovery community as they do, everything that Sin City's known for. So,
wow, Lois, thank you so much for the opportunity, Lois. Please stay in touch. All the best to you, and thank you for all the good work you're doing in Arizona and in Las Vegas. Have a wonderful day, Lois.